Welcome back to our 4-part Ultimate Grower's Guide on everything you need to know to grow as much food as possible in your garden or on your farm, with all of my tips that I have learned in over a decade of growing my own food. So before I get started on part 3, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button so that you can watch all of the videos in this series and be notified anytime we put out great content. All right, let's get started. So this is part 3. Now let's recap a little bit what part 1 and part 2 were about. So basically, I gave you as much information as I can about all of the tips and tricks that really make a difference when you're trying to seriously grow your own food for yourself, your family, or your community. Everything from buying the best seeds to using the best genetics to seed starting, basically the beginning of a plant's life and why all of those steps really matter. You want to start off with the best from the very beginning. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about everything that happens once you get those babies up to a good size and how we plant them out, what the soil needs to look like, and just, what things you can avoid, errors that you can avoid that will save you time, energy, money, and heartache. So let's get into it. So I've got down here cute little baby. So this is a cauliflower that we have grown from seed, and I've got it to a pretty good size that I'm going to plant out. Now, here's what I want people to remember. It is so easy to make big mistakes at this point in your gardening journey. You've done all this work to get this baby beautifully grown and happy and big and strong, and you're really excited to put it out into the garden, but there's some big mistakes that you can avoid if you just listen to these pro tips. So, first of all, you want to make sure that your transplant is an adequate size before you put it out into your garden. We get people who ask us all the time, well, what size should my transplant be? Unfortunately, I don't have a exact number for you. I can't say your transplant should be 6 inches. But what I can say is that your transplant should be really happy and healthy and strong enough to survive the environment that you're going to plant it in. Now, depending on what your garden is like, it could be a pretty hostile environment. If your soil is not fabulous, if you have a lot of pest issues, if it's a really hot time of the year or cold time of the year, your transplant is going from an ideal home, the greenhouse, and coming out here into the garden where it's just, it has to deal with a lot of different things. So you want to make that transition as comfortable as possible for the transplant. So I would say this is a little bit on the small side, but for the sake of the video, I just want to show you what this looks like. And so again, it's not necessarily about size. Let's look at the root system. Okay, so this is a pretty good looking root system. Now I could leave it in the greenhouse a few weeks longer so that it grows a little bit bigger, but I feel confident that with a few prevention tips when I plant this out, that it will do just fine. What you want to avoid is planting the transplant out when it's too small and the root system is too little, or letting it become root bound in this pot. And what is root bound? Root bound means that the roots in this soil has taken up all of the soil and become so confined in this pot that when you pull it out, almost no soil falls away and all the roots are entwined really tightly in this pot. The reason why you don't want root bound plants, and this goes for not just the ones that you're planting, but also the ones you purchase from the nursery, it's because when you put it in the soil, it's really not going to do much. It's going to be very stagnant because its roots are so wound up and so stuck in their position that they don't go and explore and grow quickly. In fact, there are, some claims, and I haven't tested it myself, but if you take a root bound plant and put it right next to a seed planted, a direct sown plant, oftentimes the direct sown plant will outgrow the transplant just because it has all this area to grow and its roots are free to go and search for water and nutrients. So you want the roots to look more or less something like this. Now, so that's number 1 tip, making sure your transplant is healthy and at a good stage to put into the ground. The next thing that is so incredibly important that people often make the mistake of, they transplant their little baby into soil that is not adequate. And what do I mean by that? Meaning that it's either too dry, too hot, too many weeds, too compacted, all of these things that are not great for a transplant. you can tell this soil is super light and super fluffy, and the transplant has grown very quickly. We want to mimic that in the garden. Now, I've got here a row, and I'll tell you right now, all this stuff here didn't even plant. All this cilantro, that popped up from last year's seed production. And that happens because over 5 years of working on the soil, we have made the soil so happy and so beautiful that things just pop up. I mean, look at this. I'll show you what this soil looks like. Now that is beautiful soil. Dark, rich. And now it's taken us some time to make the soil like this. Remember, gardening or farming is not a destination, it is a journey, and this takes time. And unless you have an endless amount of money to bring in soil that's already this beautiful, it's going to take time for you to develop that in your pots, in your garden, if you're growing in birdies beds, any way that you're growing. The soil has to mature to get to this level. And that takes time with moisture, compost, beneficial insects, beneficial microbes, all the things that make nature amazing and complex. It happens in the soil and it takes time, so you can't rush it. Now, if you're really interested in soil and how to get beautiful soil like this, stay tuned and make sure you subscribe to our videos, because in the future, we're going to do a video all about my journey of how I built the soil to look this amazing, and the steps that I took and the steps you can take in your garden or on your farm. So now I've got my transplant, I've got this beautiful soil. If your soil does not look like this, if your soil is hot, dry, sandy, just devoid of organic matter, you're going to want to try to get it as close to this as possible when you go to plant your transplants. Now, the first and most important tip that I tell people is you have to water before you transplant your transplants, especially in zone 9 and 10 where we are so hot. Over Thanksgiving weekend, we had record temperatures. It felt like summer. I wanted to go to the beach and surf in November. Now, if I take this beautiful, tender cauliflower plant and I put it out into the garden, into dry soil when it's 80-some degrees, it's not gonna thrive. So I always recommend water before. If you have a large container box or large pots, it's a good idea to saturate every single inch of that soil, maybe 24 hours, maybe 48 hours before you plant, to ensure that at no point the little transplant is gonna dry out. In this particular scenario, I've got the drip line and it's been running consistently because I have it watering my cabbage here. And this is what is left of the cabbage after we had a pretty intense gopher battle. But I'm already watering the garden, so the garden hasn't dried out at any point. It is consistently moist. And it's important to note that water and moisture is the #1 thing that soil microbes need to stay alive. So if at any point you have soil that becomes completely dry and devoid of any moisture, well, it's going to kill any microbes, and those microbes are what helps develop healthy, mature soil. So that's important to remember. Sometimes we water the garden, we run the drip tape, even though we don't have plants in the ground, because I'm actually watering all the organisms that live in the soil that grow my plants, basically. So the soil has been adequately moist. You can tell because when I hold it in my hand, it sticks together. It's not saturated with water where water is coming out, but it is sticking together into a little bit of a form, but it breaks up nice and easily. We have tons of mulch on top of the soil, and that is to help keep moisture in so it doesn't dry out and keep the microbes in the soil thriving. And now, so if your soil didn't look like this and you're transplanting in your garden, what I would recommend that you do is you dig your hole. If you have very poor nutrients in your soil, you're gonna wanna put in a little bit of organic granular fertilizer. How do you know if your soil is poor on nutrients? Get it tested. Soil testing can be very inexpensive. We have kits on our website that you can order that will help you know how much nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and micronutrients are in your soil. And you need to know that so you know whether or not to fertilize. And it'll save you time and money, because 9 times out of 10, you might find that your soil is actually very high in nutrients and you're wasting your money putting more fertilizer in there. It's not gonna do anything. So I would add organic granular fertilizer. I don't need to do that because I know our soil is fabulous, just had it tested. And I would pre-water this hole. So I would fill this hole up maybe 2 or 3 times and let it fill up, soak through, fill up, soak through, so I know that there's ample moisture in there. Now, we're planting at a perfect time in the day. The sun is low in the horizon, it's early in the morning, it's not going to get that hot today, and I know that my baby can withstand the temperatures that we're gonna have. Now, if you're transplanting tender transplants in the fall in Southern California when it's very hot and very dry, I highly recommend that you transplant in the evening so that the plants have all evening to get acclimated before they're hit with the really strong rays of the sun. You also can use shade cloth, which we use constantly in our garden and on our farm in the fall, or row cover, which helps reflect a little bit of the light. Anything you can do to protect your tiny little babies before they get hit with the harsh rays of the sun is a really good idea. So I'm gonna take this transplant and I'm gonna put it in the ground right at soil level, okay? So I'm not putting this in way down here where the soil is compacted around the plant. That's because this tender little stem is basically the most delicious thing in the world to roly-polies and other insects. So I don't want it below the soil level. I want it nice and even. And put a little soil underneath there. There we have it. I've got my little baby put in the ground. Now, you could, if you wanted to, transplant this in here and just leave it be. If you don't have a lot of insects in your garden, roly-polies, snails, slugs, pincher bugs, it might be okay. I know my garden like the back of my hand, and I know we have a thriving insect population here, and if I just plant this without protecting it from anything, the next morning when I come out, it's very likely that this is just gonna be completely mowed down. So as a prevention or protection for this plant, I'm gonna use either diatomaceous earth, which is a natural product. It's basically ground silicate, which is found in the environment. And I'm gonna sprinkle that around the plant to prevent snails and slugs, roly-polies from actually mowing down this plant. The other product that you can use is Sluggo Plus, which is a product that you can use on organic farms or in organic gardens. And it's a granular product that you can put around the transplant to ensure, again, it doesn't get mowed down in the middle of the night. Now, I only do that when I transplant my babies because they should get big enough and be strong enough and be resilient enough that they can outgrow any insect damage once they're a little bit bigger than this. And so I only do it at the beginning. I'll do it once, and that should take care of it and protect them until they get big enough and happy enough to defend themselves from any insects. All right, so what are your next steps now that you've transplanted your baby and you've protected it through its infancy or its, toddler stage, right? What's the next thing you're gonna do to get this plant up and growing and big and strong? Well, depending on the results of your soil tests, which again, highly recommend that you get that done, you may need to fertilize more than once. Granular organic fertilizers tend to be low in their nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And this plant's roots, as you saw when I pulled it out of this little pot, are only so big. And so it can't go searching for nutrients quite yet. So you want to get nutrients right at the base of the plant. We really like using fish emulsion because it's a easy to use liquid fertilizer that's very low in its numbers, and it actually can be soaked up by the plant very quickly. So if you notice that your plant is really stagnant, it's not really doing a whole lot, as long as it's getting full sun, because it does need as many hours of sunlight as possible during the winter to photosynthesize and grow. If it still looks stagnant, you probably want to fertilize, and you can do that with a liquid organic fertilizer like fish emulsion. We just water it right around the plant, very simple. The plant can actually soak it up through its leaves and through its root system, which is great. You get twice as much ability for the plant to take up that nutrients. And you're just gonna watch it grow, and you're gonna be amazed at how quickly and how happy it grows because you avoided some of the common mistakes right at the get-go from transplanting your transplants.